Welcome to The State of Us. Real people with honest opinions and the future of responsible media. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Thank you all for tuning in. There are nearly 60 million people, almost 1 in 5 Americans, living on farms, in hamlets, and in small towns across the landscape. And guess what? Lance and I are part of that. So we're going to talk to you today about the ever-widening gap between rural and urban America. It's all from an article in the Sunday Review section in the New York Times entitled Abandon America. And we're going to talk about the relevance of this. I mean, obviously, you got 60 million people living in these areas, so that's a fair chunk of us. And we're going to look at maybe what possible solutions there could be, a little history of what the problem is, how we got where we are, and what's next. I think we've got something unique to offer today. We'll find out. But of course, we couldn't begin a conversation on rural America without
your friendly redneck liberal, Lance Jackson.
So I'm a minority in America, huh? At this point, because I live in the rural part of our great nation.
That is one way in which you would classify as a minority.
Okay.
Yes. And what?
Very interesting.
You care to share with our listeners what state you hail from? I mean, you're in Ohio now, our great state, but.
Oh, born and reared in Missouri.
Okay.
Down in the Ozark Mountains, just north of the Boot Heel.
Did you ever have much of an accent?
Did I? No, everybody sounded like me.
When you came, how about when you came to Ohio? Did you think that people here had an accent?
Oh, certainly.
An accent.
Yes, most definitely.
Excuse my nasal on accent.
I had spent my formative years, 2 years in New Mexico.
Okay.
And 2 years in Iowa. And my parents both being educators and working in education or getting an education when I was in those two places. People said that, they could tell that my parents were from the South or whatever because they spent more time there.
Sure.
And I had some, but I don't really think it's not like when I go back home with my cousins.
Yeah.
But if I go back for a week, I can start twanging pretty easily. I mean, it's not hard for me to get there.
The pure redneck liberal comes out.
The verbiage, Uh-huh. You don't drive a truck, you drive a rig.
Yes. Yes.
It's not a creek, you jump the creek.
Yeah.
And you don't live over the hill, you live in the holler. So, it's almost more verbiage.
Yeah.
Than it is the twang. But no, my family, very well educated, but living and staying in southern Missouri, they twang pretty well.
So, you got the Missouri roots there kind of. So New Mexico and Iowa were early years.
2 and 3 and then second and third grade. But at 12, I moved to Columbus, Ohio.
Right.
So
you've been in Ohio most of your life.
Right.
Okay.
At this point, yes.
The Great White North.
Columbus until I was in my mid-20s, from 12 to 20. So here is where I've spent the majority of over half of my life. Yeah.
So, and you came to the great city of Urbana because there was a job, right?
That was it. And the people here thought they were urban.
Yes.
Remember that? My first year of teaching, the football team qualified for the playoffs. They were going to play Columbus DeSales, and DeSales had a pep rally, and they showed the football players from DeSales in overalls with pieces of straw in their mouth, and the students at Urbana, at the local high school where I taught for 30 years, were all offended. And I said, "What? You are a bunch of hayseeds." And, they're like, "What? No, we're not. That's no." And they were naming the schools in the nether regions of Champaign County. And I'm like, "No, you're with them." Yeah. Compared to the kids who go to Columbus DeSales.
Sure.
And go to Columbus Public Schools, like I did.
Yes.
You are Hicks.
It's relative. And this is where I grew up, Urbana. So, but Lance is right from the aspect of it is a matter of perspective. I mean, Urbana in comparison to someplace like Mechanicsburg, which is a village near us, or West Liberty, it is a lot bigger. I mean, it's in some cases, 5 or 6 times as big as them. So, but then again, you take someplace like Columbus, and Columbus is, 10, 20, 30 times bigger than Urbana. So yeah, it is relative, but for the purpose of this conversation, as we're talking about rural America, the 60 million people here, we're talking about those that live on farms and live in small towns or urban areas. Small towns generally being things with under 30,000 people. So you're not going to see, for the purpose of this discussion, going over that. Like, Springfield, Ohio. I met people from there who, well, we're from a small town. Well, relative, right? I mean, we don't look at, people from Urbana don't look at Springfield and say, oh, that's a tiny little town, because it's 3 or 4 times our size. So again, that's that relative thing, but so that we're all on the same page. Now, the problem, Lance, this is why people have to pay attention. Rural communities once captured a greater share of the nation's prosperity. During the economic recovery of 1992 to 1996, 135,000 new businesses were started in small counties. This isn't that long ago. A third of the nation's total. Employment in small communities shot up by 2.5 million or 16%, twice the pace experienced in counties with a million plus populations. So in fact, less than 30 years ago, you had the growth, the employment in small towns increasing faster than that in large towns. And now, of course, it's definitely the opposite of that. So it's not news to people living in small towns. I mean, we know that we've been stagnant for a while. The United States has grown by 75 million people since 1990, but this has mostly occurred in cities and suburbs. Rural areas have lost some 3 million people. So really not a ton. I mean, 3 million isn't that much. And this is what I was telling Lance before the show. It's not so much that rural areas are drastically declining as they're not growing. So these urban areas, they're growing, they keep getting bigger and bigger, and places like Urbana just mostly stay the same or decrease a little. Maybe they have little up spikes here and there. New factory comes to town or whatever. These days, economic growth bypasses rural economies. In the first 4 years of the recovery after the 2008 recession, counties with fewer than 100,000 people lost 17,500 businesses, according to the Economic Innovation Group. So since 2008, 10 years, counties with less than 100,000 people lost nearly 18,000 businesses. It's a lot. But by contrast, counties with more than 1 million residents added 99,000 businesses. So it's outlining a little bit of what's happened now. There are 1,888 counties in America in which more than half of the population is rural. And they stretch, according to the Census Bureau, from coast to coast. So whether you're looking at the plains of southwestern Kansas, where there's 1,790 people in an area of 800 square miles, or in Perry County, home to 26,500 people in eastern Kentucky, or Essex County in New York's Adirondacks, which is 3/4 rural, and so is Cavaliers County in California. So the point is, they're everywhere. And even if you're one of our listeners and you're in a place like New York, there's people in your state who live in these places. They're everywhere. And that's kind of the crux of why do you care? Well, because look who our president is. And it isn't, we can say it's, and to an extent it may be, but I think the big thing is you have these small communities that feel, rightfully so, like they're being left behind, because they are. It's not the point in me going through all this, and I know it's a lot of numbers, is that we haven't deluded ourselves into thinking that we're being left behind. We are being left behind. It's happening. It's very real. But
we're only 20% of the population. So if you're in business to make money, you don't necessarily make a business going after 20% of the population.
Unless you're Dollar General.
That was the example I was going to give.
Right.
Now, there is a niche market where some of these places are going, which Dollar General is just the 1970s version of Walmart.
Yeah.
Because when I left Missouri in 1973 and moved to Columbus, we would come back for vacation every August, and Mom would buy our school clothes at Walmart before we came back to Columbus because there was nothing that cheap in Columbus. So, I mean, I remember, Walmart being around a lot earlier than most people. And that's how they started. Benton, Arkansas is right across the border from where I grew up. And that was where, Walmart sprang up, was in those small towns that weren't serviced by anybody else. I mean, we were an hour drive from what most people would call, a shopping center. I mean, we used the JCPenney and Sears catalog store,
right?
Early versions of online shopping, the mail order catalog. That's how we got most of our things, because other than a local general store and one grocery store and a mom and pop grocery store, there was nothing else in the town of 4,000 that I grew up in. And where my parents grew up was a town of 400, and there wasn't a grocery store.
Yeah.
I mean, they had to go 30 minutes. There was a place where you could buy milk and bread and lunch meat, for sandwiches for the people who logged or worked in the mines. But if you were going to do your weekly, monthly grocery shopping, you had to go 30 minutes away.
That was the option.
Right. Or an hour if you wanted to buy a dress or a nice suit or something like that.
Yeah.
Then it was an hour and a half drive to go someplace if you didn't order it in the catalog.
So Lance is our senior resident historian here at TrueChat. He'll appreciate the historical perspective. So some of you may be asking, well, I mean, why is this happening? It was working good, right? I mean, even back in just the 90s, not that long ago, things were okay. Things were looking up for rural America. Well, what happened? Well, since World War II, small town prosperity has relied on its contribution to the industrial economy. The census considers Price County, Wisconsin to be 100% rural. So a county that's 100% rural, even in that county, over a third of the jobs there are in manufacturing, from building industrial machines to assembling trucks. Auto parts manufacturers in West Point, Georgia, draw workers from 2 counties over. Manufacturing employs about 1 in 8 workers in the country's 704 entirely rural counties. That's more than agriculture, forestry, fishing, mining combined. And it's second only to education, healthcare, and social assistance, which includes, by the way, teachers, doctors, nurses, and social service workers. In other words, of those 3 categories, government employed individuals. So you only have healthcare, which in many cases is government subsidized now, that is in front of the private manufacturing industry. So the point is, factory jobs can't keep small town America afloat anymore. Even after 8 years of robust growth, which we've all been experiencing, there are fewer than 13 million workers in manufacturing across the entire economy. So that's counting urban areas, Lance.
Right.
So you've got 60 million people, 13 million factory jobs. That doesn't add up, especially since a handful of those jobs in manufacturing aren't in rural areas. They're in urban areas.
Right. Well, because with delivery and the way businesses run now, they want to be next to an airport, the interstate highway system where trucks can run and get their product anywhere they want to, because nobody stocks a big inventory anymore. You make things on order. You don't want to have a store full of things that aren't moving.
Yeah.
So, you run out and okay, now you ship from the distribution center, which is usually close to an east-west, north-south interstate, so that you can ship to your stores wherever you go. You don't find that in rural America. I mean, where I grew up, and even here in Urbana, we're 30 minutes from the interstate. And that's not what companies want to do these days. They want to be on the interstate. They want to be next to an exit ramp and buy that big field and build their distribution center or their factory so that they can get their products to market quickly.
Yes. Well, and that is the advent of the online.
And you go to rural
convenience.
America, it's even more. In Missouri, I was an hour and a half from the interstate. So of course you're not going to have any factories, because the nature of business since the 1990s has changed. You just don't keep stuff in stock. You just order it every week or 10 days or 2 weeks.
Well, and even for the most part, a lot of our factories aren't real factories. They're assembly lines.
Right.
Where none of the parts were actually made here. We're just putting whatever the thing is together.
They run the truck driver. The truck drivers run between the assembly plants with the parts. And that's where, and again, they run 8 hours ahead.
Yeah.
I mean, they don't have 2 weeks worth of parts stocked. If there's an issue somewhere in the line,
everything,
it slows down because they only have one shift's worth of parts in the assembly plant at a time.
Yep.
I mean, it's unloaded off a semi, thrown into the bins and put on the vehicles and shipped out all within the same shift.
So, let's talk about, we'll leave you with this question before Lance tells us what we're trying to do here. Cause you might be saying, okay, well, what do we do about this? But before we answer, what do we do about this? We'll have to answer, should we do anything about it? You might be saying, what? Of course, we got to do something. Well, we're going to talk about that, but just a second. Before we do, Lance, tell us, why are we talking about this kind of thing? What's TrueChat working on trying to accomplish?
Well, our mission is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations.
And if people don't feel like we're doing that, how do they get in touch with us?
They call you at your home and they complain to you about what's going on here.
You give them my landline.
No, they contact our ethics department, which we are big enough. We have an ethics department.
Yeah.
And they listen to your complaints. And if they feel that we have not followed the mission statement, then they will slap us on the wrist or maybe take us off the air.
That's right.
Depends on how badly they feel like we have behaved and not, held to our mission statement. So we do take it, seriously here. And, we want to make sure that we are being respectful and that we are trying to educate America on some of these other issues that you don't read about in the mainstream media.
Yes. The mission statement's not something that you'd want to parse apart because really in order to effectively educate, if you're not being honest, open, and respectful, then you're going to have a hard time doing it.
Exactly.
Because last time I checked, if somebody is trying to teach you by getting up in your face and telling you you're a stupid, dumb idiot, you're probably going to be more in the fight or flight mode than you are going to listen to what they have to say.
You tend to shut down and not listen.
Yeah. It's a protective thing. So if you want to let us know, what you think of the show, good or bad or indifferent, you can do so at TrueChat.org on Twitter and other social media. So please, engage with us. Let us know your thoughts. So should we do anything, Lance? Should we address this problem facing 60 million Americans? What do you think? He's thinking. He's also sick, folks, so give him a break.
I want to know. I mean, I knew that was coming. Part of me says, yes, we do. But then on the other hand, it's like, I mean, I've seen this as a school teacher, as an educator, starting in the 1990s. Young people didn't come back. The best and the brightest in our schools.
That's the key.
Didn't come back here. And they said, well, what would I do? And I understand, there aren't good paying jobs. I mean, the people that came back, 1 or 2 lawyers who just wanted a small town feel, former students, educators.
Yep. And
no doctors, maybe a veterinarian or 2 because we have farm animals, and our medical care here is not good, in this county.
Yeah.
It just isn't.
Well, it's not just us, right? I mean, that's a different problem facing rural America, but healthcare is a major.
Because there's nothing here. Nobody, you really can't make money here. And if you can, it's not the kind of money you can make somewhere else. And you don't have access to the latest devices and machines and everything else to be able to help people like you got trained, to do. So you find it's really hard to bring those people back because there isn't anything for them. So I guess, okay, you could try to come up with something that would bring them back here. But then my other issue is why? It's only 20% of the population. So is it something we need to spend? Are we getting our biggest value by spending money on these people which is me, or are we better served to spend our money, our tax dollars on things that help out the majority of the population? So I guess as I'm sitting here thinking about it, as much as I would like to help, and I think small towns have a lot of good for the country, I'm not sure that we really should spend an inordinate amount of money. I mean, if we want to spend 20%, because we're 20% of the population, that's fine. Should we spend 50% to prop up 50% of the money that we make as a nation to prop up 20% of the population? I don't think that's a good idea.
I'll explain now. So I'm trying to take as much of a factual answer to this as I can, because everybody's got to remember, both Lance and I, nobody's going to come at this unbiased. The author of the New York Times article even spends a whole paragraph to say he's lived most of his life in cities. He doesn't pretend to understand what it's like to live in a small town or on a family farm, or how it feels when all the jobs in a community seem to be fading away. So everybody who's listening, whether you're in an urban area or a rural area, we all have to keep in mind where we're approaching this from. And for Lance and I, it's spending the majority of our lives in little tiny towns or in completely rural areas. I grew up on a farm outside of Urbana, Urbana mailing address, but not actually in the city. I now live in, quote unquote, in city limits. And as Lance explained, he comes from a very remote area. So the point in that is we have a reason to want to try to save it. So it's nice when you hear somebody like Lance say, yeah, maybe, but only to an extent. So here's what I'm going to give you to think about, Lance. I think there's a way that it affects 100% of the population. There's some serious problems facing big metro areas. I think what's happening at the moment is the growth is overshadowing that, as to where we're not seeing it being addressed as much. We're going to start with cost of living, because to me, that's the biggest one. The problem is the more densely you populate people, the more expensive it is for goods, services, land, because they're in higher demand. It's the kind of economy we live in. As long as we're going to be capitalist, the more people you squeeze into a small area, the more expensive everything will be.
Yes and no. Go ahead. I'll let you finish.
Yeah.
I'll let you finish.
There is a proportional amount. There is a proportional ratio there. Keeping in mind that if you live in Manhattan, right, and you work in Manhattan, you're also making a lot more total dollars. I'm not talking about proportionally. I just mean total money. You're making a lot more than somebody in Urbana on average. However, though, that's keeping in mind that the cost of living is also significantly higher. So a bigger portion of your money, more dollars, not a bigger portion, more dollars go to living. And in some cases, a bigger proportion, because you have to keep in mind, if you want to own a car and live in a city, there's different costs with that. If you're not going to own a car, right, there's costs with moving around. So there are things indicative to both areas that equal higher costs or lower costs. But my point is, as we congregate more people in these densely populated areas, these places have not done a great job yet of figuring out how to avoid continuing skyrocketing increase in cost of living. And the bad thing about that, because even if we say, okay, well, but the people who are making good money proportionally, it's not a big deal. The people who aren't, and there's a lot of those in big cities, they get left further and further and further behind as that happens. Because as their rent skyrockets to north of $3,000 and they're living on, $30,000 a year, that starts to become a big problem, because there's just not enough money left to ever get out of that cycle. The rent just keeps going up and they just get poorer and poorer, even though they're not actually making less money. They just don't have as much to spend because what it costs to live where they live is so expensive. And then say, well, great, they move out to small towns, which are already impoverished. And so the cycle just continues. The wealthy move, or the middle income people move to the urban areas, and all the poor people go out, and they all use their drugs and, all of that in the rural communities. And it perpetuates the problem. So that's the big one. Which then these next two are kind of together, health and climate. They're related to cost of living, not as directly, but obviously the more people congregated in one area, until we shift to a greener economy where there are less cars and there's more forms of mass transit that operate on green energy, cities are very expensive to operate because of the mass infrastructure in an area. So there's some things to consider there, both on a health standpoint of your risk reward ratio of if you live in a city and there is, heaven forbid, some kind of biological attack, or maybe not an attack, just an outbreak, you're a lot more likely to get sick. At the same time, though, you're probably more likely to be able to get care. So there's some trade-offs, like most of these things. But I think there's a way, Lance, that we fix it and it helps everybody. But you got anything else here on, because we've talked, there's a lot of downsides to living in rural communities. Anything else that we can add to urban areas that's a more factual thing? Because I know you and I could add things like, well, maybe we don't want to live around, people on top of us and on either side.
Well, but that's why I moved and taught here. I didn't make as much money. The cost of living was down, so I could live off of what I made, even though I could have made more teaching 45 minutes away in the big cities. And I could have stayed in a small town, which we have a lot of people that do that they stay in these rural areas and then drive to work in the metropolitan areas because you can live cheaper, which is fine until you retire, which is where I am now in my life. And because I didn't make as much money, I don't have as much money to retire on. So now I'm kind of limited as the places that I can retire to. Whereas if I'd lived in the city and made the extra money, I would have more in retirement and then I would have more options to go. But I just think there are things in the city that are cheaper because there are so many people there.
Yes. Economies of scale.
Well, when you start, but also not just that, but like internet, food choices, all of those things are cheaper a lot of times in the big city because there are more customers there. I mean, there are certain places. I mean, we don't have food delivery. There are places where, there's a national pizza chain. Two of them in town. One will deliver to me. The other one won't because of where I live. So, there are some give and takes there. And, my internet and my viewing of sports and everything costs a lot more here than when I lived in Columbus. And a lot more of my income, percentage of my income, because there were so many more customers that these companies could sell it cheaper than they can now. So there's good and bad. I think it just comes down to where you want to live and understand what you have to do. I would approach it more, and this is very stereotypical, but there are some things that the city folks are running from that are kind of ingrained in country people that are good to have. But now that's kind of going by the wayside when you look at the opioid epidemic and things that are happening here in rural America that are kind of taking away the value system as the reason why I brought my family here and wanted to raise my children here, which was good for them, but I'm not so sure it's good anymore.
That it'll stay that way.
Yeah.
So now I'll give you.
I'm not sure it's good now.
Right.
I would not want my daughters to come back here and raise my grandchildren. It's not the same environment as it was when they were here.
Interesting. Something else to explore, but I'll give you my proposed solution here that hopefully fixes all this, Lance, including that component. Because part of it, right, is as you highlighted, the best and the brightest leave and they don't come back. And that's not to say that the rest of society doesn't have something to offer, but anywhere that it's totally lopsided is where you see the extremes turn bad. It's just like when you go to incredibly concentrated wealthy areas, they have their own problems. And I don't mean the area, but the people. They have very, very first world problems, but they have them. They get caught up in things, have more difficulty finding meaning, so on and so forth, some things that they struggle with. And of course, when you leave poor people together, frequently what happens is you have them turning to find ways to make money that aren't legal. And in our country's case right now, it's drugs, opioids. and for ways to relieve the pain and suffering, which also happens to be drugs. So it serves kind of a twofold purpose. And then it sucks away the little dab of income they do have, and so on and so forth. You guys get the idea. But here's the solution. There's two things, Lance. Government and tech, okay? Government, two things in government, and then I'll explain the tech point. Government has to, and this'll sound funny, has to get involved and get out of the way. And what I mean by that, first, government has to make it easier for businesses to attract people here. Everybody focuses on the tax incentives for businesses, but it's the kind of tax incentives. Okay. It's the kind of tax incentives. If I told a business owner, you can raise wages and it will cost you nothing, they'd probably look at me and say, well, where did you learn to do math? Because that's not how things works. Right. It doesn't typically. If, say, the city of Urbana raises the minimum wage from, city of Urbana doesn't have a minimum wage, by the way, just for what it's worth. So it defaults to the county, which is lower than the state. So it defaults to the state. And the state of Ohio, I think right now is $8.25, Lance. So we initiate a city wage of $12 an hour. So if you're in city limits and you're an employer, you got to pay your workers $12 an hour. Okay. Whoa, but now we're going to cripple the businesses. Now hold on now. Okay. This isn't bad. This is good for businesses. And the reason they can write off the cost associated with increasing wages. So say it's about $4, right, Lance? $4 an hour.
Okay.
They can write off that $4 an hour on their taxes
that they owe the city.
Right. And then you're going to say, well, wait, won't that cripple the government? No, because what? The people are making more money, which means we take more in income tax. What we're doing is simply redistributing the way the money flows to make it easier for us to get ahead, for businesses to be competitive. Because the problem is, if the businesses only can ever pay the minimum wage because they don't have a way to get above that, nobody wants to come here. No good new businesses want to come here. Secondly, okay, so that's your government perspective, Lance. The second piece of this is tech. And tech doesn't fix everything because I just highlighted the government. It doesn't fix it by itself. It's ironic, though, that the tech startups congregated in these major metropolitan areas, I think, are 50% of what saves us. Because while automation is killing the small town, it's also what saves us in the respect to, for example, food delivery. Automated cars, they fix this problem. Drivers don't have to sit around on the clock. Furthermore, tech, healthcare, a big one, right? Your quality of care. I just met with the new administrator at the Memorial Hospital here in Urbana. They have a new Da Vinci robot, which can be operated by great surgeons basically anywhere in the country. These kinds of things related to technology, while many things are scary to all of us, small town or otherwise, they will be the things that enable people to live and have the type of life they want anywhere in America.
Have the quality of life.
Have the quality of life. Yes. Have the quality of life they want anywhere in America. But we can't just leave technology to do it all on its own either. Because going back to the government component, so you've got the government taking care of the people and the businesses. There's another business component there. The government has to work to foster relationships with companies like Apple, Amazon, etc., to make it more possible for remote workers to be a bigger reality, telecommuters. It's already starting. I mean, there's been a lot of talk. There's been articles in the Times, the Journal about this, the new telecommuting thing and live wherever you want and do it. But there are some obstacles like internet infrastructure, right? So I think there's that component too. You have to partner with companies who are going to offer jobs to people in towns smaller than X. And why are they going to do that? Because it's cheaper to pay people there. But those people are making proportionally more money as it relates to their cost of living than if they lived in a big city. Mm-hmm. So there's an advantage to the workers going there. There's the advantage to the businesses because of taxes and that they can pay people more, proportionally speaking. And you have the benefit of reducing overcrowding in cities and spreading out our population a little bit more. And I don't mean sprawling in terms of lots of houses. I mean, spreading it in terms of already existing municipality areas. Because a lot of these places they've shrunk a little bit, or they have inside the municipality enough space, but they have lots of abandoned areas or, what have you that just have to be reclaimed. And the last tech piece is innovations in mass transit. There's a National Geographic thing about the Hyperloop train that Elon Musk, has proposed. And there's already testing going on around this idea.
Right.
Super high speed trains. And it's funny because you, Camden, and I talked about this on the War to Save America. If you remember, it was his mass transit initiative.
Right.
To go back to rail, which is funny because, the country mostly moved away from that. Reclaim rail as kind of the new mode of transportation. It's good for the climate because less cars. It's good because it means that if you lived in a place like Urbana and Columbus is 45 minutes away, which really isn't that far because there are people who do make that drive.
Right.
But that means you could get to a place like Columbus in 10 or 15 minutes. And of course, if you live an hour and a half away, maybe you get there in 30 minutes, So things like that are going to make the difference in being able to do this. But it first takes cities who are going to take charge and say, we're going to change the wage situation and we're going to make it so businesses can handle the change in the wage situation. And then it follows by those partnerships in tech saying, hey, look at this very competitive system we have set up. We're demonstrating that we're doing more than just saying we're going to give you free tax money.
Right.
No, we're going to give you a kind of tax money that is helpful, because that was the thing with Amazon or Amazon's second headquarters,
right.
When they were talking about this, that was the thing. Everybody was like, most of what the cities came up with was tax abatements. We'll just give you this much back in taxes. But $8 billion for a $500 billion company is not. Yeah, I mean it's something, right? I mean we don't just turn away and slough, but it's like, okay, what else you got? I mean that's nice, but what else you got?
There are other things we need.
Yes. So towns investing in internet infrastructure to make telecommuting feasible and putting regulations in place specifically focused at wages that offset the effect for business. I think that's the solution. So you tell me quickly.
If you want to survive into the 21st century.
Yes.
I mean, further deeper into the 21st century.
Because manufacturing is going away. That's, at least in its current form.
There's no argument there. I mean, except for the older people that tend to run these small towns and want to hang on to those ideas that no longer exist and are dying. You have to look at it in a new way if you're going to keep your small town from becoming obsolete. Right. So I like what you're saying. It makes sense.
Is there anything major you see wrong with that?
Well, you have to.
That approach.
Again, there's where the 20% comes in. You're going to have to get the government because these small towns aren't going to be able to handle the infrastructure of the internet or rail service to bring those companies here. So it's going to take spending that 20% of tax dollars on rural America in a smart way, in a way that will encourage businesses to come to these small communities.
We'll talk about how
to encourage then people to come here to live and work because it's done. I mean, my brother-in-law in California takes the commuter train an hour and a half into Los Angeles.
Yep. Because it's cheaper to live out there.
Right.
So, I mean,
he lives an hour and a half from LA, but there's a commuter train that he walks to, gets on, works on his laptop while he's up for the 3 hours that he's on the train, plus does his work in the city.
Yeah.
A couple days a week. So it exists where there are people where the government has the money or felt that it was in their best interest to do that. So now you're going to have to do that now in rural America where there aren't as many people.
Right.
And they don't have the funds. The small municipality of Urbana doesn't have the funds to bring a modern internet system here. So you're going to have to get some government grants, block grants and things like that that are dictated to be spent that way in order to entice these new businesses here that you're talking about. That then when these businesses come here, then like you said, people will come, oh man, I remember when I grew up in a small town or grandma and grandpa lived in a small town. I like that. I want that slower pace, but I still want to be able to do this job that I'm doing. Well, now I have that option.
And that's what a lot of people in cities do anyway, right? I mean, they go in, they get the job they want, they find somebody that they want to raise kids with, and then they move to the suburbs.
Well, and they
which is like seeking that small town kind of feel.
There are people that like that fast paced life.
Right.
And like having everything at their fingertips.
I did that in downtown.
But then
for a
there
while.
are people who are like, man, if there was a way I could slow down, I would choose it. But I can't because my job, I need to stay here. But if you give them the option of slowing down and keeping their job, there are people that will slow down.
Right.
Not everybody, because there are people that like to live right where everything is and have everything at their fingertips.
And I think the beauty of what we're talking about when it comes to things like the mass transit and the future is that people won't be forced to have to make that choice anymore. I don't think we have to accept that the greatest country on earth has to accept that it's either or. We're all about have your cake and eat it too. You know, that's what we do. That's what we do. It's what every time we're faced with problems, that's usually what we do. Well, how can we have both? You know, well, we can. It's just but
it's going to take people.
It's a process.
It's going to take people and probably, again, the stereotype, younger people to take a different look at the same problems.
Yep.
Because the old solutions aren't going to work anymore. So you're going to, you don't have to be young to do that. But if the leaders are older, they're going to have to look at different solutions than what worked in the past 40 years because those solutions aren't going to work. So there are solutions. You've pointed them out and I agree. I think there's some issues there that I've discussed, but at the same time, those at least have a chance of working. Going about it the way we went about it back in the 80s and 90s is not going to solve the issues that are facing rural America.
Yeah.
We're going to have to look at it through a different lens.
Well, the funny thing is too, as I'm thinking about it, we're reading this book, right? Capitalism, a History. And it's all about America and capitalism. And there's a big part spent on the railroads. And I just think it's funny that some of these ideas, again, they're really not new. They're just modernizing really old ideas. You know, we're not talking about when my parents grew up or even when their parents grew up. We're talking about before any of them were born, 1800s, right? The solution to get people to go out west was the government had to convince railroad companies to build railroads where nobody was.
But what the government did was they gave land away.
Yeah.
To the railroad companies.
Right.
To build those railroads. And they didn't all exist. Some of them lost. I mean, there were 2 or 3 economic depressions.
Yeah. There was like 200 something railroad companies that went bankrupt.
Right. So not everything worked.
No.
But they threw it out there, and the ones that did work through luck or whatever reason moved the population westward and the country grew economically.
It's what made us a national country instead of a state country. I mean, I think that was probably the thing, Lance, that took us from I'm from Ohio to I'm an American.
Right.
Because we finally were a country instead of this massive span of land that took months to get across.
Well, and then as people spread out, that created a new set of problems, which then allowed for a new group of entrepreneurs and builders to find a way to solve these new problems.
To fix those problems. So that's what I'm getting at. It's not the exact same, and I'm not saying the exact same solutions apply. It's the methodology behind those solutions that I think is we have to figure out a way to use all this new power, all this new tech that's at our fingertips that's already here. It's not about inventing things that don't exist. It's just about implementing them now, figuring out how to make them work for us instead of against us. Because
applying them differently, applying them in ways that they haven't been applied before.
The thing that killed rural America will also be the thing to save it. And the sooner that small towns wake up and realize that, the sooner they get away from downward prosperity spiral. They got to use it to their advantage. The rules have changed. So play by the new rules. And then you win. Don't holler and scream that the rules have changed, because that ain't going to fix it.
Nope.
If that capitalism book has taught me anything, Lance, it's that capitalism is going to march on. So you're either going to get on board or it's going to trample you and leave you in the dust. Yep. Those are the choices. It's not going to stop for you. And I don't mean you, Lance. I just mean us in general.
No, so true.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, let us know your thoughts. Maybe you got a different idea. I know we ran a little long today, but I think it was good. It's, like I said, something that Lance and I know firsthand, living in a community like this and witnessing a lot of these problems. So at TrueChat.org, Twitter, Facebook, and more. So let us know your thoughts, please. Do you live in rural America? What it's like? And if you live in urban America, what do you think of these ideas? Do you want to help those 60 million, that 1 in 5 Americans, that 20% of the country? And maybe you don't, and that's okay. Just justify it. Let us know your thoughts. Maybe it's different than what we got. So Lance, how can people listen if they want to tune in to TrueChat?
Well, anywhere that Apple Podcasts are found, Stitcher, Spotify, and any other ones, I guess, that also carry podcasts.
Yeah,
you know?
Pretty much any other
any
podcast
other
platform.
That's right. Platform. That's the word I got to get. Platform.
Well, you did the fine podcast first.
I did.
And that goes at the end usually.
Yeah. Well, hey, I'm trying to be different, you know? You just said we need to look at things differently. I started with the last thing first.
Took it apart and
redo it. Maybe it sounds better.
That's right. Okay. All right. Well, thank you all for tuning in. We very much appreciate it. For the State of Us, I'm Justin T. Weller.
And I'm Lance Jackson.
From Urbana, Ohio, the town you've never heard of. Thank you so much. We'll see you next time on The State of Us. Be the change.